Revolutions begin when a group of people refuse to abide by the laws of their society. That's exactly why the American colonists broke away from British rule, because they didn't like the laws under which they were forced to live. You would think that the descendants of revolutionaries would take more care in drafting their own laws. You would be wrong. Some US politicians have passed bills and acts that are morally wrong, infringe on citizens' rights, or impose their own reprehensible beliefs on an entire country. 5. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 inches. Beginning in the 1830s, abolitionists in the North had finally begun to coalesce into a more powerful group, frightening slave owners in the South. There was already a Fugitive Slave Act on the books, which granted local governments the power to capture runaway slaves and return them to their owners. But people in the South felt that it didn't go far enough. They were also worried that people in the North would help to hide runaway slaves, which the Southerners couldn't abide. So, as part of the Compromise of 1850, which was designed to assuage Southerners' fears and their threats of secession, the government passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. An incredibly harsh, pro-slavery measure, it forced citizens to help capture runaway slaves. If they refused or aided a runaway slave, they were faced with a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. In addition, the act denied slaves the right to a jury trial. After the Civil War broke out, the process of repealing the law was shelved until 1864, when Congress finally took it off the books. 4. Black Codes. The Black Codes, a collection of laws passed throughout a number of Southern states in 1865-66, can be seen as a precursor to the Jim Crow laws with which people are more familiar. Even though freedom was preferable to slavery for blacks, the situation was still fraught with constant racism. In fact, some would argue that current conditions haven't improved as much as they could have. Under the codes, blacks were required to sign yearly labor contracts. If these onerous agreements were left unsigned, blacks could be arrested as vagrants and forced to work for free. These laws also barred blacks from serving on juries and limited their ability to travel, which mirrored legislation in place since the Revolution. President Andrew Johnson, who rose to power after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, was a Southerner and a firm believer in states' rights. He felt that the South had the right to treat blacks however they wanted as long as the blacks weren't slaves. It wasn't until the period of radical Reconstruction that the treatment of blacks in the South began to improve. At that time, the Republicans essentially overruled President Johnson, passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, among other things. 3. Alien and Sedition Acts. Shortly after the American Revolution, with the Constitution and the rights granted under it still fresh in everyone's minds, the President and Congress decided to stomp all over it. Fearful of a French threat to the country, the U.S. government passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws granted the government new and far-reaching powers to deport foreigners, a problem which one member of Congress described thusly: "There is no need to invite hordes of wild Irishmen, nor the turbulent and disorderly of all the world, to come here with a basic view to distract our tranquility." 8. It should come as no surprise that immigrants were much more likely to support the other party. The Alien and Sedition Acts also infringed on the First Amendment, making it a crime to publish false writings against the government. Inciting opposition to anything done by Congress or the President was also deemed to be a criminal act. Though no foreigners were deported under these laws, 10 people were convicted under the Sedition Act. Thanks to a change in Congress and the diminished threat of war, nearly all of these laws were repealed a few years later. 2. Indian Removal Act. Indian Removal Act is yet another reason why Andrew Jackson is the worst president in U.S. history. A longtime advocate of what he called Indian removal, Jackson had fought against a number of different tribes, stealing their land and giving it to white farmers while he was an army general. When he became president, Jackson continued his crusade, signing the Indian Removal Act into law in 1830. It gave the federal government the authority to take Native American land east of the Mississippi and give them land west of the river. Though the law required Jackson and his forces to negotiate with the tribes without threat of violence, that part was often ignored, resulting in the Trail of Tears as the most noteworthy and widely known of the expulsions. For example, of the 15,000 Choctaws who were forced out of their ancestral lands, approximately 2,500 died during the resettlement. Worst of all, Jackson believed that he was implementing a wise and humane policy designed to save the Native American tribes from extinction. 1. Public Law 503 inches. President Franklin Roosevelt had already issued Executive Order 9066 authorizing military officials to detain anyone they felt would hinder the war effort. But he and his cabinet understood that they would need to codify it eventually. Thus began one of the most shameful periods of U.S. history, the unlawful internment of over 127,000 innocent Japanese American citizens in the 1940s. Based on an erroneous belief that all Japanese Americans would flock to their ancestral country if the U.S. was invaded and the fact that the majority of them lived on the West Coast, internment camps were set up in the middle of the country. In addition, nearly 2/3 of those interned had been born and raised in America. Many of them had never even been to Japan. Though Public Law 503 was eventually challenged in the Supreme Court, it was upheld, with the court justifying it as a wartime necessity. When the war was over, many former interns were unable to return home, with some cities even putting up signs declaring them unwelcome. It wasn't until 1988 that Congress tried to apologize in any way, offering surviving interns $20,000 each.